starting this monthly regional pastors network Zoom. It's good to see you all, and it's good that we can connect in this way. And this month, as you'll be aware, we're trying to tackle that issue that causes many of us to wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. The business of safe church, which is something of a behemoth, really is a leviathan, a monster. But never fear, because Transform Southern Sydney has 2 safe church ninjas taking part today, and they're going to solve all our problems, just like that. Well, no, I can't promise that, but I do hope that what they have to present and share will be helpful to us all. So we've got Katie Watson with us. Katie works for our association and in the area of safe church, so I'd like to welcome her. And we've also got Matt Willis, who'll take part a little later on. And when it comes time for Matt to take part, I'll invite Leanne to introduce him, because she knows him better than I do. So Katie, thank you for being with us. And if I hand over to you now, you can make your presentation, and we look forward to what you have to share. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Tim. Thanks for inviting me so that I could speak to a group of people at once. So I'll just start off by saying you're always welcome to email or call if you have particular questions about implementing safe church things in your particular context, because we've done as much as we can to support churches, but there's quite a wide variety of ministries, which is super exciting, but it does mean that it can be a bit difficult to set up something one size fits all. So do always feel free to get in touch if you've got a particular question. And sometimes, although it's not strictly part of the safe churches part of my role, I have taken on a lot of the COVID related safety questions as well. So yeah, I guess if you're doing something you're not sure if it's safe, you can always email and ask. I've just got, because I do a couple of regional, just see how that goes. So can you now see that Transform Southern Sydney update? Excellent. So I've just got a couple of slides sort of to help me make sure I don't forget anything on the way through. If I can work out how to make them go forward. Yeah, okay. So some of the stuff you might already know because we've been doing updates over a period of time now. So I'll just kind of race through them and then give you an overview of the Safe Church Health Check, which contains most of your responsibilities, most of those things that Tim thinks will cause cold sweats and lack of sleep. And then I think we're going to throw to Matt before we do questions, which will be helpful because he might answer some of the questions about application stuff as well. So the first thing is creating safe spaces, which is the thing that's probably been around the longest. With the restrictions, we pivoted really pretty quickly to being on Zoom so that people could still be doing that training. And particularly if you're doing online ministries, it was really important to have people trained in creating safe spaces. So we're now offering the option of Zoom or the option of in-person if you can maintain the various restrictions. We can also offer workshops in Mandarin and Korean. So it's great to see David and Yvonne here because they're both presenters with creating safe spaces. Beginning of next year, we will launch what we call CSS 3.0. So basically every 3 years, we rewrite and revamp the material because we require people to do the training every 3 years and no one wants to do the exact same training again. Not to mention, as you will see when I move on to some of these other slides, things can move pretty fast in this space around the area of legal requirements. So if you want to host or attend a workshop, you can contact Joseph in the office or you can just go to the website, all the information's there. That's a lot of text on one screen, and I will send these slides through for you to refer to later. But the newest thing that sort of came out and started in March, about 5 seconds before everything shut down and no one wanted to talk about it anymore, is the Reportable Conduct Scheme. So the Office of the Children's Guardian has recently got a lot more, I guess, responsibility / power. The Children's Guardian Act came into play in March this year, and one of the big things for churches is that churches are now subject to the Reportable Conduct Scheme. So the sort of big picture overview is that this means you have to have policies and procedures in place for certain things, particularly around reporting, but also around code of conduct. So that's sort of one big thing ongoing. Even if nothing ever goes wrong, the legislation means you have to have those policies and procedures and code of conduct in place. The good news is we've already written them for you. Probably a lot of your churches have already adopted those model procedures, but if you haven't already, you can go onto that same Creating Safe Spaces website, find the model documents there, discuss them with your leadership. You can adapt them a bit, and you can talk to me about what may or may not be a good idea to adapt, and then you've got them to go and you're satisfying that requirement, which is already a law in New South Wales. But the other change is that if there is an allegation of reportable conduct, then you must report that to the OCG within 7 business days. And so the things, there's a lot of detail around that, and that detail's covered in Creating Safe Spaces. It's covered in our documents. If you have any questions, you can email me. But in terms of just something to remember, the biggest piece around that is that it's about allegations. So you don't need to work out whether the thing really happened or not. Is it true or not? You know, people have these concerns about innocent until proven guilty. This whole system is allegation based. So the point of it is basically the government is stepping in to make sure that organisations take allegations seriously and give them proper consideration. So you have to make the report while it's still at allegation stage. Then you go through considering it, making a decision, and then you report to the OCG about that investigation and decision. But it does mean it's a little bit counterintuitive to report to authorities before you've worked out exactly what's going on. And so in terms of, that's about any staff member or volunteer that needs a working with children check to engage with. If the church requires them to have a working with children check, they're subject to the reportable conduct scheme. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is reportable conduct is pretty much any misconduct to do with children, any allegation of misconduct, but it's not the whole world. It's just, there's specific definitions, but it's all pretty much anything to do with children. But it is any time in their life. So if you've got a youth group leader and they get into this is the example Jonathan often uses, they get into a fight on a Saturday on the soccer field and punch maybe they're 19, they punch some 15-year-old soccer player on the soccer field, nothing to do with church, that still needs to be reported because it's to do with a child and because that person is required to have a working with children check for their engagement with the church. So that reportable conduct can be conduct in any area of their lives. As I said, ask me questions about details if and when situations come up. The general ideas you need to have in your head is that you need to have the policies and procedures set up and that it's an allegations-based scheme. If something happens, give the Ministry Standards hotline a call, always the best thing to do. Also, the investigations can be pretty detailed. So we are training a pool of investigators and the OCG is coming out to do some training later in November for that, so that can be a resource to different churches that may not have the resources to do that themselves. Okay, so the Safe Church Health Check launched almost a year ago now, but obviously that last year has not been exactly what we might have predicted. Some of the big questions that come up around that is, what's the deadline? So there is no deadline as such for the Safe Church Health Check. It's provided as a resource for churches to address their legal requirements. So at this stage, you don't even have to ever do the Safe Church Health Check if you don't want to. Of course, what that means is you have to navigate your own path through all the legal requirements, and I certainly wouldn't want to be doing that. So we've pre-navigated this path. It's definitely the easiest way for you to address all of these things. In terms of deadlines, I've put here, so 1st of March is when the reportable conduct scheme came into play. Also an expansion of the mandatory reporting scheme. We were already recommending that everybody act as if they were a mandatory reporter, so the practical difference probably won't be felt, but actually it is now mandatory for anyone providing religious services or activities for children is a mandatory reporter. In September, there was a declaration required to Baptist Insurance. Some people thought that was the Safe Church Health Check or that they were linked, but it was a really simple declaration. Now, it did promise that you had policies, which obviously you'd need to start implementing the health check to be making that declaration honestly. And sometime in the next 12 months, the government is going to regulate the child safe standards. So the Safe Church Health Check is structured around the child safe standards so that when that legislation comes in, our aim and our hope, and I guess in conjunction with talking to the government, our understanding is that there shouldn't be anything additional for churches to do. If they've addressed the Safe Church Health Check, that should be enough to satisfy whatever comes into place with the child safe standards regulation. So in terms of an update, we've had 35 applications and constantly getting calls from people with questions about the last little bits of their application. So the wave is really building. Those applications have come from a whole range of churches. We were talking before, churches with, I think the most is one church had 160 volunteers that they'd screened and put through all of the different processes. Other churches where once you get past the 2 or 3 leaders, there aren't any other volunteers and there may not even be children in the church. So quite a wide variety. Linguistically, culturally diverse, the context's very, very different, which is kind of cool, I think. Some churches have found COVID's made it easier for them to do this because they've got other things that have been put on pause. Some churches have found COVID's been an absolute nightmare because they can't just like front up to somebody, give them a piece of paper and say, fill this out while I'm standing here. Also, we've started a Safe Church newsletter. We've had, I think, 2 of those so far. So if you're not getting that, you can contact me and ask me to put you on that list, or your Safe Church team should be on that list. So in terms of what the Safe Church Health Check does, it seeks to address all your current legal responsibilities. Within the little booklet, every church will have been posted the booklet and some jelly beans, hopefully. There's one side of the page is explanation and the other side is the actual questions. Once you've gone through it, you can actually submit it online. But I would recommend going through it either on paper or in some kind of draft format because it's just easier to discuss and you want to get all of your leadership involved. Based on what people have done, and I think this is kind of what Matt's going to speak more to in a second, although it's structured according to the 10 child safe standards, from a standing start, this seems to be the way to get going. The first thing to do is to appoint a Safe Church team because this should not fall on the shoulders of the senior pastor alone, particularly in larger churches. But it also doesn't mean that it just automatically falls on the children or youth ministry people. So you want to set up a, your Matt's smiling there. You want to set up a Safe Church team. Needs to have at least 1 male, 1 female person on the team, and then they can be driving this. But they really need leadership support. Adopt the model documents that I talked about before, and then you start to implement. The biggest hurdle, the biggest job, the biggest amount of work in implementation is the screening process, because all our volunteers need to go through a screening process. So that means at a minimum for every volunteer, they need to fill out a screening questionnaire and sign a code of conduct. For anyone in child-related work, and remember that includes all of your elders, deacons and leaders, they need to also have a Working with Children check and complete the Creating Safe Spaces training every 3 years. So that's basically where a lot of churches are. They rush through stages 1 and 2 and then they're just trying to get this screening and training in. Once you've done that, you're ready to complete the application form. As you go through the application form, you'll see some other little questions, and for most churches, 1 or 2 of the other questions are going to be things you need to address. So maybe you've got a residential property that you rent out, maybe you've got a particular link with an overseas ministry, maybe you have you rent out the property somewhere. There's a whole lot of little bits and pieces. As you start to fill out the application form, you'll go, oh right, what do we do about that? Maybe you're already doing the right thing. Maybe you've got to put some documents in place. And then you submit. At the moment, there's a bit of a delay in processing because I'm rewriting Creating Safe Spaces and interpreting the government's ever-changing COVID legislation. But I'm hoping that in a couple of weeks, I will get to sit down, get everything up to date, and post heaps of pictures about all the churches that have put work into completing the Safe Church Health Check. Because at the end of the day, there's safety of children is obviously our children and vulnerable people is obviously our priority from a defending and protecting people perspective. But I think in a lot of contexts, we were already doing the right thing. We just need to be ensuring and documenting the right thing. And the reason we take those extra steps is to communicate to the communities around us that those are our priorities. And recent McCrindle research suggests that I think it's something in the order of 70 or 80% of people say that abuse in the church has given them a negative idea of the church. So when you go out and you're trying to go into the community or to plant churches or whatever, the pushback you get is a range of things, but one of those things is this sense that the church has not done enough to address abuse in the church. So in addition to actually stopping harm from occurring, one of the really important things that this Safe Church Health Check does is gives you a forum to communicate to the people around you and the families and communities you engage with. This is how far we will go to make sure you feel safe when you come into the church. And that's removing one of the hurdles that could stand in the way of people hearing the gospel at all. And so when it is a lot of work and when it does cause you, as Tim suggests, to wake up in a cold sweat, you think it actually does contribute to mission in a really significant way by being an opportunity to demonstrate clearly our heart. And so that's important. Now, ordinarily, I'd go straight to questions, but I think we're going to get Matt to address some of them instead. And then afterwards, we'll have questions and you might have something particular to ask. But thanks.
Okay, thanks, Katie, for that. That's wonderful. So Matt's going to chat with us a little bit more about the practical implementation that he's undergone at GBC. Matt's really quite experienced when it comes to young people. He's worked in ministry and government roles for the last 7 years. So he's done things like statutory child protection, adolescent and family therapy, and he's done high school chaplaincy as well. So he's quite experienced, and that's probably why the reason why he got the job from Mark Rader to head this up. Yep, and
he didn't want to do it.
And Matt's been on staff at Gymea Baptist Church for 5 years as a youth pastor, and he has worked on this with Brett Robinson as well. And together they have just done a massive job. So Matt, over to you. And just let me say before I should go there, if you've got any questions, stick them in the chat. And if we don't get to all of your questions, Matt is generously offering another hour of Zoom. So he's happy to chat with you and answer your particular questions about implementation. So Matt, all yours.
Right on. Okay, so I guess like many of you, we were in the position where we did stage 1 and stage 2. We developed a Safe Church team. We took the Safe Church package and all of the policies on board, and then we were struck with the task of implementing them into our own systems and processes within our own context. I know that the flow charts that we've kind of created kind of as a step-by-step of how a volunteer kind of works through this process at GBC has been distributed to everyone. And I'll talk about that in a second, but I just thought, because we're all speaking from different contexts and different experiences, I just thought it might be helpful to kind of outline a couple of key lessons that we've learned in this whole process and kind of wish we had have known at the beginning. And hopefully if you're at the beginning, that it can be kind of helpful for you in that space. So yeah, I think the first thing, I've got 3 because we're Baptists and that's what we do. But the first lesson that we've kind of learned is around that distinction and definition of participant and volunteer. I think when we first received the Safe Church package, it seemed very black and white, which in a lot of ways it is and it needs to be. But particularly with having some long discussions with Katie, you know, we've found some of the situations within our own GBC context where there are some shades of grey, and one of those really significant ones is defining what is a participant and what is a volunteer, because a volunteer is someone who has to go through this process. There's no if, buts or maybes. If you consider their role a volunteer role, and there are a few things that I think play into that. Is that a role that's rostering? Is it about being a part of a team? I think a big one is, does their involvement put them in a position where they are representing the church. I think those things really constitute a volunteer, but we found that there were a lot of roles within our church that probably fit more in that participation space. And we kind of had to now backtrack a little bit, because we kind of sent out this blanket email, everyone has to do this. And now we're in a position where we're like, oh, actually, if you do X, Y, Z, we're not going to make you, because we kind of see that more as participating in the general ongoing of the church. So a few examples are kids and families. We have kids pray in our services, read the Bible. We have families pray. We have kids involved in video content for Christmas and all sorts of things during the year. And we consider that their participation in our church. Normally that's done through kids ministry. And so it's a part of their participation in the ministry, but it's also a part of their participation as a wider church community. Ministries like the Bible reading in the service and praying from the front within a service, even though they're roles that are rostered for us, and you are a part of a team that is rostered and we rotate through, we've kind of made the decision that that's a participation of the ongoing of our services, our gatherings each and every week. Whereas a distinction would be if you're on the prayer team that prays for people after a service, that's a volunteer role. And we kind of distinguish the two because one gives a position of authority and influence to speak into someone else's life, and one is more a general praying for what's going on in the community. So finding that distinction and kind of going through the different roles that your church might have within ministry, and kind of distinguishing, is this someone's just general participation in being a part of a community of faith, or is this someone volunteering? That's been something that's been helpful for us, and it's just kind of cleared up a few of the shades of grey where we were kind of confronted like, are we really going to ask someone to go through this whole process just so that they can pray, openly in a service for a 10-year-old to pray? And being able to distinguish that has helped us kind of answer those questions a little bit more. I think a second lesson that we've learned is, as we've kind of developed this system for implementing the Safe Church, the thing that we've kind of had in our mind from the very beginning is that it needs to be flexible and it needs to be adaptive. Something that Katie kind of mentioned to me in one of our many conversations is that you can't be held accountable for policies and procedures that haven't yet come into place. So, the standards in 2020 might be different in 2030, but volunteers who are serving now won't be held accountable to those in the future. But at the same time, what that demonstrates is that policies and procedures will continue to change. And so we've been really intentional with, particularly with the idea in mind that we've got to keep files and we've got to keep information for, 45 years. There's going to be a lot of changes that happen. And so the system that we create in each of our contexts needs to be adaptive, because having something that's simple for now may not be simple in 20 years' time when you've thrown another 200 volunteers through that system. And so I think as you're thinking through what your system looks like, what we've found important is to ask that question, is this able to pivot quickly? Are we able to add new information into it and potentially take old information out easily? And does this have some longevity? So you might have noticed, if you've looked at the flowchart, we're using Elvanto, which is a platform that a lot of churches use. And by holding all this information, all the Safe Church information in Elvanto, we're able to have that flexibility and adaptability. We can add new fields into a person's profile that can document certain pieces of information, and we can take that out. It also is able to spit out a report for us with all of that information, every single volunteer in that space. So ultimately, we don't have a Safe Church register in the sense of we don't have a live document that's being updated. We update Elvanto, and then if at any point we get asked for our Safe Church register, Elvanto will actually produce that for us. And so I just think having that longevity will help future generations of ministry leaders who work in your context, because something that might be simple now might not be in 30 years' time. And we probably, this version of our Safe Church policy was our fourth. We worked through a number of different ways of doing things. And one of the challenges that we kept coming up with was retaining this information in a simple and succinct way won't work in 40 years' time. And so that's how we kind of landed with where we're at. And finally, the third thing that we've kind of learned is that there are huge relational and pastoral implications to this. I think this process has led volunteering in ministry, the experience of getting involved, it's left it feeling a little bit impersonal, because it is a whole bunch of paperwork and a whole bunch of hoops that need to be jumped through, and rightfully so. But that's been a huge pushback that we've experienced in our community, because it stops that organic kind of tap on the shoulder. Hey, like, we'd love for you to get involved, and hey, I'm just a willing participant who's kind of passionate about this. Let's make this happen. And so that's been really hard for people within our community. It's been particularly harder for our older demographic. Our system is all digital. COVID, we have done a huge audit of our paperwork, and we never want to go back to paper ever again. And neither does our shredder machine. But that's been quite difficult for our older congregation. I think it's also been, so it's been hard for them to engage with. It's also been hard because for some of them, they've been serving in this role for 20, 30, 40 years, and they've never had to do this before. So why now? So we've had to navigate that. We offer support, so we're happy to sit down with people and walk them through it. We've kind of had to adapt again and print off some of that information only to later shred it. We scanned it into our system, but then shred it because we don't want that paper just physically on the property. But it's also meant that a lot of people in our teams have kind of said, hey, this is a good opportunity for me to tap out. And that's left some of our teams lacking. Obviously, we're in COVID and a lot of those teams aren't happening, but it means that if we have to go back on Sunday, let's say, a lot of our ministries won't occur. And that's something that we've now got to manage. And I think finally, where that's this kind of relational piece and pastoral piece has been difficult is that some people who have been serving in ministry have ticked yes to one of the questions on the screening questionnaire. And that's hard for them. It's hard to maybe acknowledge that, to front to that. It also puts us in a difficult position because now we're backtracking. It's like, oh, well, we should have known about this, and now we have to deal with this. Now, nothing overly kind of complex, and no huge investigations that need to occur, but there is a huge pastoral aspect to this. And so it's not what we've found, and I don't think it's a surprise to any of you, is that it's not as simple as kind of sending out a few forms and saying, hey, we'd love for you to fill this out in your own time. There's a lot of relational currency that needs to be spent in that space to support people through it, but also to support people who might have some concerns that kind of get raised through this whole process. So they're kind of like the three big things that if we had have known at the beginning, we probably would have done things a little bit differently. So the whole participation versus volunteer, adaptability and flexibility, and then the pastoral relational cost of it all. I'm aware that I've gone 10 minutes. I'll quickly go over a few aspects, a few choices that we made when we implemented the Safe Church package. So you've got the flowcharts. You can look at them if you want. One thing is we chose language around eligibility and suitability, and you'll see that in the two flowcharts. The process of suitability was something we already had at GBC. For someone to get involved in youth ministry, we already had role descriptions. We would get them to fill out an application. There would be an interview, And then we, 9 times out of 10, bring them into a role. And so that kind of already existed. But that eligibility piece is predominantly what the Safe Church package is. And I guess that was our way of using language that was helpful to kind of communicate what the Safe Church process is actually all about. Is there anything that is probably stopping you from being involved in certain ministries? And so it's for that reason that we've made a few decisions around levels within this process. So the first choice that we made, and this probably flows into the adaptability and longevity piece, is I know that there are 2 different types of screening questionnaires, that for people working with kids or vulnerable people or in leadership, and those who aren't. But if you've looked at them, there's 2 question difference, or 3. And so we made the decision, the executive decision, to just make everyone do the more detailed one, the children, volunteers, leadership one. And that was so it allowed a volunteer to have flexibility to move within ministry. If someone like me, when I first came to Gymea, the first ministry that I joined was welcoming. But then I became a youth leader. If I had done that in this process, I would have had to fill out 2 screening questionnaires. Whereas by getting every volunteer to just answer 10 questions instead of 8, it means that if you've answered it once, you've answered it forever, unless your answer to any of those questions changed. So it just, again, it helps it be a little bit more approachable to people. We're not asking them to double up. So that was one decision that we made. Another decision was the level of clearances that we give people. So rather than someone doing the screening questionnaire and it's you're cleared or you're not, we've done eligible, which means like your references have been checked, you answered no to all of the questions, and you have a working with children's check, which means there is no reason that you can't serve in any ministry role. We've got eligible, no working with children's check, which is pretty self-explanatory. You're all good, you just don't have a working with children's check, and so you can't serve in ministries that require that until you get one. We then have eligible under 18, which triggers the whole, do we have consent from a parent for them to be involved in ministry? And then we have eligible with restrictions, refer to Safe Church team. So if anyone answers yes to a question on the questionnaire, it gets referred to the Safe Church team for them to decide whether or not this is going to result in restrictions in their involvement in ministry. And so rather than having that information everywhere for everyone to see, any ministry leader to see, it's just to direct ministry leaders as they're kind of trying to figure out, is this someone who could be on my team? It directs them to the right person to talk to. Now, I'm on the Safe Church team, so I don't even have to necessarily tell you what this person's background is, but I can just say, listen, we spoke about it and we don't want that person serving in kids or youth, or we don't think it's appropriate for that person to be in a mixed gender setting, or to be able to speak freely from the front. Whatever the concern might be, we don't necessarily need to divulge that information, but we can make it really clear what those restrictions are. And so that's about balancing confidentiality, but then transparency as well. And then the final level is not eligible, which is obviously self-explanatory. For whatever the reason, this person shouldn't be serving in ministry. And then to kind of jump to the other end of the process, we chose to create a level system within our code of conducts. The code of conduct that was provided by the Safe Church package was super helpful. It was also super confronting. And there was a lot of points in there about sexual purity and financial integrity, and a lot of assumptions even around what a person's relationship with God looks like. And for GBC, there are certain ministries where you don't need to be a follower of Jesus to be involved. If you want to be on our coffee ministry and you can do a good latte, like, we want you. And so we didn't want the code of conduct to be a barrier for people. So we created 3 separate levels. A level 1, which is a general code of conduct, we kind of minimize some of the language around relationship with God, to just be around, and I think I've got it up here, around exploring your relationship with faith and, yes, nurturing it, being on a journey. And then we took out some of those more detailed points in the second section around sexual purity, financial integrity. We kept all the stuff around, you're going to follow the Safe Church policy, you're going to do the screening questionnaire, you know, you understand reportable conduct, all that kind of stuff. But it's just less intense, I think, particularly for someone who might want to be making coffee. We then have level 2, which is for anyone in leadership or working with children or vulnerable people. That has almost all of what the Safe Church package provided. We just took the staff element out of that, which was the whole, you're going to agree to the Baptist Association Code of Ethics and Conduct. That section was saved for our level 3, which is for staff. And so, yeah, just those few decisions of, it's a bit more work on our end, but it helps with that communication on the other end. So it makes the code of conducts a little bit more attainable for where someone might be at. But it also means, we hope that that also facilitates flexibility within this system. If you've signed a level 2, it means that you can serve in any ministry that's a level 2 or below. And all of that information is documented on GBC links. I can jump on, look up Leanne's, let's say, and I can know what level she's eligible at, what level code of conduct she's signed. And that then just informs me, if I want to bring her into my ministry, what I might need to do. I feel like I just verbal vomited all over all of you. I hope that made sense. And like Leanne said, I'm more than happy to answer questions if I can. We're still learning, and by no stretch of the imagination is this a perfect system. We're still testing and troubleshooting, but these are just some things that we've learned that hopefully might be helpful for you guys in your context.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for sharing your practical experience of rolling out Safe Church. And thanks again, Katie, for sharing the information that you did. Let's open it up for questions. If anyone has a question about where they're at, feel free to speak up or to pop it in the chat, and Katie and Matt can respond.
Matt, just a question on the form that you sent out, the flowchart for suitability. Can you just explain what the green application form, blue application form, purple?
Yeah, that's something specific to GBC. That's how we kind of categorize different ministry areas. That's not a Safe Church thing. We categorize ministry areas on level of intensity, so how much time is required to do that role, but then also level of expectation. So a level green would be someone who wants to be on the coffee machine. We're not going to expect them to, have made a declaration of faith. Whereas a blue level is youth ministry, and we very much expect them to have made a decision of faith, and we have greater expectation. There's a greater time limit. So yeah, that's a system that we already had around how we categorize ministry levels, but it's got nothing to do with the Safe Church space.
David?
Okay, thank you. I want to ask you, Katie, thank you for your doing, and with Jonathan is amazing. So really appreciate what you are doing. My question is that, when I apply to my church context, we are very thinking about stage 3. So when I join advanced intensive and creating safe space, you mentioned about this is a procedure all include all existing leader, right? I want to touch with you. So existing leaders.
So that's, yes, it does cover all existing. Is that what you're saying? Do we have to go back and screen? So people who are existing leaders, people who are existing volunteers, yes, and that's why it is a bit of work to set up. Because if you have, so the screening questionnaires and things have been, and versions of a code of conduct have been around, I understand, for a decade. I've only been in this role for about a year and a half, so I understand they've been around for a decade, but they haven't really been pushed or compulsory. So yeah, if your church has not already been screening and requiring codes of conduct, then yes, it will mean essentially backfilling. And this is, I think, a lot of the work that Matt's been doing as well, is it's not just new people arriving and saying, let's get started this with doing a new volunteering role. It's people who've been around for a while. And I think that's also where the pastoral implications come in that Matt referred to, is that you've got in some churches, people, I've had examples where somebody's called me and they weren't born when some of the people have started volunteering, and they've got to go and ask them for forms with reasonably personal details on them. And so, yeah, that is definitely a pastoral need there. But from a practical point of view, yes, everybody, no matter how long they've already been volunteering or already been on staff, is required to do all of these steps.
Reason why I ask you, because I already learned from you, already knew this,
Yeah.
but many people ask, think, concerned about this one, because it is a lot of time consuming, and also like in my church, family size church, many senior volunteer leaders there, so it takes a long time to encourage them to do this one.
Yeah.
So this is just to explain is what my church, how our church context looks like. Second question is that quickly. So what about this one is that we can, I can send in all documents to leader, and then they can read this one, we accept this one, and then they can sign, and after scanning, and then they can come back to Safe Church team, and then we can keep that documentation in electronic one, rather than paper one. Yeah. 45 years. Is it okay, do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, you can keep your documents paper or electronic. That's really pretty context specific. Sounds like Gymea has a pretty thorough electronic storage system. For some churches that would freak them out, or they just don't have the capacity to set that up. So paper is best. So one or the other, or both. The important thing is that it's reliable. And it's there's some level of security there. So, just open file boxes in the front office, probably not appropriate. So it really does depend on your context, but it is okay to keep them just electronically if that's what suits you.
Yeah, thank you for your advice. Yeah. One of my big prayer point is that family side church, the pastor needs to preaching and then more teaching and then pastoral care. On the other side, with the safe team, we have to deal with many these paperwork. So hopefully it works. And I just share the prayer point. Thank you for
no worries. Thanks, David.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm Frank, by the way. In some of the ethnic churches, they like a lot to do home groups, like 2 or 3 families get together and do home groups nearly weekly and stuff like that. What is the responsibility of the church here?
Yeah, so if they're church home groups, so if you're encouraging people to get together, or if you're listing them on a list of home groups, it's kind of context specific. But if they're understood to be church related home groups, then you need to have a bit of an idea who's leading those, things like that. But as Matt identified within the Gymea context, praying or reading the Bible from the front is a participation thing. So in some churches, praying or reading the Bible from the front would be an enormous responsibility and would, require the highest level of screening. It's just a cultural piece. And as Matt explained quite succinctly, it's about what it's representing to the people there. So if you're in a home group, it depends on how the home group functions. Some home groups, everybody from 0 to 100 is participating on a kind of equal level. On some, there's clearly leaders involved. So that detail is going to affect who counts as a participant, who counts as a volunteer, what the responsibility of the church is in overseeing the screening there. So it is pretty context specific.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Frank, if you've got if it becomes unclear, you're welcome to contact me and we can have a chat about what we think applies.
Thank you.
Some good comments in the chat there that Matt will follow up on.
Yeah.
Eddie, I've just got a question about like securing records with the Safe Church team. Like, so who has appropriate access to things like Safe Church Register, or like setting that stuff up? So is it only 1 or 2 people? Is it only the senior pastor? Like, just so that there's proficiency, but also flexibility, and not maybe just being restricted to one person? Like, have you got some thoughts about how we do that?
Yeah, so I'd recommend there's not very many things where I would say one person having access to it is a good idea, because you want to, there shouldn't be anything which falls just on one person's shoulders. So that's one of the reasons we suggest a safe church team. Other than that, it will depend a little bit on how you operate your systems. So some of the safe church registers I've seen are basically Excel spreadsheets with essentially a bunch of dates in them. So it's not going to be that much of a problem if any staff or leader can access something to see, do you have a working with children check or not? But as Matt's indicated, when you've got somebody who's answered yes, and then you've gone on to have a discussion, maybe you've documented, we discussed this, we decided the following things would be appropriate. Well, that's a whole nother level of privacy and security required about that kind of information. So it depends a little bit on how you're tracking this. I would say something like what Gymea's done in terms of having that some information is quite accessible, and then you provide a way to identify that there is additional information. It would be appropriate, and there will be some things where it might just be really locked down, like, so just the safe church team, just the pastoral team. And again, that depends on your context. Some churches, there's just the pastor and one other person, and that is the safe church team. So, it's definitely an important thing to bear in mind, and it's something it's good to sort out before, like as early as possible, because in sending out the screening questionnaires, it's a question you'll get. What happens with privacy? What happens with confidentiality? Who's going to see this? So it's one of the things that we're hearing as well.
Matt, can you just talk about the levels in Elvanto, because that's been helpful for us. You can dictate how much information people can see.
So again, I guess it's specific to Elvanto, but there are permissions that you can give people. And so only people who have administrative privileges are able to see an individual's profile, and that's where we kind of keep the whole eligible level code of conduct. Do they have a working with children's check? Have they done creating safe spaces? Have they been inducted? Have their references been checked? All that kind of stuff, so that a ministry leader can see that. We're actually still trying to figure out that tension of we need a good system of documenting those more in-depth conversations, particularly for the Safe Church team, that can be accessed. But how do you do that so that other people can't access them? Currently, this is a flaw in Elvanto, so it's not the silver bullet that we all need. Because if you're a super admin, which our operations manager is, he would be able to see all of our notes around conversations regarding a personal matter for a person. So currently, I've just created a password protected file on our server that I know the password to. Now, again, it's not good that I'm the only one who knows that password, but that's where we document our conversation, the more in-depth conversations of this is what we've decided, this is our recommendation, this is what's been disclosed, whatever it might be.
Yeah, it might be a good time to mention also that some of the yeses on the screening questionnaire and some other things that people, even if they're not volunteers, might disclose would require a persons of concern process. As part of the Safe Church Health Check, what we are asking is that churches decide whether or not to adopt the persons of concern process kind of without applying it to an individual. So is this the kind of thing we're going to adopt in general? And that way the whole leadership team knows how the system works. But in terms of confidentiality, if your church has a person of concern, so that in most cases is a known offender, somebody with an offence in their past, could be a long, long time ago, but there are some other categories as well, that requires a really high level of sensitivity and confidentiality, and it probably is the kind of thing that not the whole leadership will know. So it's important to decide whether or not you want to follow that process, so that if something comes up, a much smaller group of people can actually manage that process and be aware of the details of a person's past offence or something. And that is something where you require kind of a separate process. And that's something that happens in the association as well. There's a lot of information available on the database, but then our POC processes are managed separately, can't be accessed really by, I think, anyone outside of me, Jonathan, and Steve. So yeah, but just to be aware, as you go through, some of these things will require a call to the Ministry Standards Hotline for that risk management process through the POC.
Okay, well, as you're aware, Katie is available at the association office. You can phone her, you can email her with any questions that arise in weeks, months ahead. And it's great to have that sort of support available to us as we go about our regular ministry. So thanks, Katie, and thanks, Matt. Really appreciated your input today. I think people have found that very, very helpful. Just before we break you down into your regional network groups, and you can spend just a few minutes connecting with one another in those groups, let me trail next month. Mark Rader is going to be speaking to us about how to preach in Canadian. I think that's the subject. So
secret is lots and lots of hockey illustrations.
So yeah, very, very much looking forward to Mark leading our November session and helping us to think through how to prepare to preach and how to preach well. So yeah, looking forward to that. Otherwise, we'll ask Virginia now to send us off into our breakout rooms. And it's been good to see you all together today. And I hope that you'll be able to join us in November as well. Thanks, Virginia.